Hello friends, my name is AJ and welcome to my channel. This is going to be your review for Unit 7 array lists for AP Computer Science. This is a very interesting unit, and it actually ties quite into the last unit, which is arrays. And this time we're going to be using ArrayList, which is an alternative way of storing collections of data. Without further ado, let's get started. All right, so the first thing that we're going to be talking about is ArrayList, right? What actually is ArrayList? And ArrayLists are objects, just like everything else in Java. Remember, Java is an object-oriented programming language. But ArrayLists themselves store a collection. So they store a collection of reference data types, okay, or data objects. So if we remember from Unit 1, where we talked about the different types of variables in Java, we talked about four main data types, right? We talked about integers, we talked about doubles, we talked about booleans, and we talked about strings, right? So if you think about that, and if you remember, there were two almost categories that we separated these into. We called them the primitive data types, and we called them the reference data types. If you remember, out of the four, integer, double, and boolean were primitive data types. And then strings are counted as reference data types. Remember, because strings are kind of specific objects which we can run methods on, and then the primitive data types are stored as more actual values. So if we look at this, because ArrayList objects only store a collection of reference data types, that means that if we want to store integers, doubles, or booleans in our ArrayList objects, we need to use the reference data type version of those. And we haven't talked about this necessarily yet, not too much at least. We did mention it a little bit briefly, and I'll show you when we actually mentioned it. But we can use something called wrapper classes that will almost convert our primitive types to reference types. And so the conversion from our primitive to reference types, we have int, which is the primitive type. It converts to the integer reference type. We have the double primitive type, which will convert to the double reference type. And we have boolean, which is a primitive type, which will change to the boolean reference type, right? So now these are the three actual data types that we had, but this time inside of the reference form instead of the primitive form. And then in addition to this, remember we had string, which was also a reference data type. And then pretty much any other object that we actually create, for example, using classes, or different data types or object types that we create using classes, or any other objects in general, are generally going to be reference types. So if you look here, we have integer, we have double, boolean, string, and any objects, pretty much. Those will count as our reference types. And these are the only things we can store inside of array lists. We cannot store the int, double, or boolean primitive types in them. So that is something definitely to keep in mind. All right, so now we look at arrays versus array list, right? Because there are now two different ways that we can store collections of data. We have arrays, and then we have this new thing called array list. And what is actually the difference between them? Well, for arrays, if you remember, when you create an array, you specify the actual length of the array. Afterward, you cannot add things to the end of that. So for example, let's say you're creating a grocery list. If you are adding items to your grocery list, of course, you're not going to know beforehand how many items there's going to be on your grocery list. You want to add on to it as you go along. Arrays do not allow you to do that. However, array lists do. With array lists, you can actually add on to the end. You can add in between different ones. You can change the values of certain elements, right? You can actually remove certain elements. And the actual length, or in this case we call it size, the size of the array list is actually it can actually change. It can get bigger or smaller since the time that it was actually created, unlike arrays. So when we talk about this, we really want to kind of think about why we would maybe use arrays instead of array lists or array lists instead of arrays. Well, generally you will use an array if you're having more rigidly structured data, meaning you do not want the size to change. It is actually intentional for you to keep the size the way it is. Another reason why someone may use arrays is that it takes up less space in RAM because you set the amount of size, or you set the actual length of the array beforehand. You already know the amount of space it's going to take up in memory. So that's pretty much the only reason why people would use arrays. Now, generally, a lot of people will prefer to use array lists. Why? Because they are generally more flexible. Again, you can add on different things and remove different things from using an array list. And that way, array lists are a lot more flexible, and they are generally what will be most used because, again, I talked about a grocery list example, or, you may have an assignments, list of assignments, or you may have, you could have so many different things. You could have entries in a journal. All of these things you want to be able to generally add on afterward instead of just having a set rigid structure. That's what array list allows you to do. All right, so we talked about now the difference between arrays and array list. Now we can talk about actually creating an array list. So this is the code here to actually create an array list right over here. And this looks really long, so let's break this down a little bit. The first thing is you have the array list type, which is right here, array list type. And this, obviously, if you remember, in creating any variable in Java, the first thing you write is the data type of the variable that you want to create. So if I want to create an array list variable, I will first write down the array list type, because that is the type that I want to create. And it's going to be capital because array lists are also reference types along with pretty much all of the other things. Then something unique about ArrayList afterward is that you have these arrow brackets. Brackets. You may call them something different, less than, greater than symbols, whatever. I'm just calling them arrow brackets for now. And inside of the arrow brackets, you actually put in here the reference type of the list contents. What this means is that this is the type of data that's actually going to be stored inside of your array list. And remember, we talked about above, they have to be a reference type here. You cannot put primitive types. So if I wanted to, again, do an integer one, I would write array list integer like this, fully. I would not write down int, right? So array list int, for example, this is not what I want to do. I want to write it using the reference type version of the actual int. Then the next thing you do after you write this type with the new unfamiliar arrow brackets thing, you then put here the actual variable name. So the list or the variable name. List or name. And this is going to be how you refer to the new variable that you've created. This is the same along with all of the other variables that you've done. In addition, something, again, the same with all the other variables, you then do here your assignment operator. So if I can fit this in, assign operator. Then afterward, just like when creating the creating the arrays, you're going to use the new keyword. And we use the new keyword when you're creating or constructing a new object. Then over here, we are going to be constructing a new array list. So we're going to call its constructor. So the array list constructor. Now, if you notice here, again, you have arrow brackets. Arrow brackets. You have arrow brackets again. And then inside of these arrow brackets, you actually put the reference type again. Reference type of list contents. The actual type that you put here should match the type that you put over here. They should be the same. Then what you're going to do which is the last part of this, is to add your parentheses right here. So this is your parentheses. And the parentheses are again for the constructor. This is technically all part of calling the ArrayList constructor to create a new ArrayList object. So now when you actually do this, you're going to be creating an empty ArrayList. So all of these lists start out empty to begin with. They will not start out with anything in them. And you have to use certain methods to actually add new items to your array list, which we'll be talking about next. So we can now go into talking about the array list methods, and there are a few of them which you need to know. The first one is going to be the get method. And the get method will return a specific item from a list at the given index. So just like with when we talked about arrays where we have indexes, remember indexes refer to the location of elements inside of the array. So having an index of 0 is actually the first element. Remember, that's something with strings and arrays which may have been a little confusing. The first element is at index 0. Then you have index 1, index 2, index 3, just like that. And those will increase as you move down your array. So just like with arrays and array list, you also use indexes. And to return an actual element out from an array, you use list.get. And then inside of the parentheses, you put the index of the element that you want to get. So for example, let's say I have an array list like this with three string elements: hi, hello, and bye, just like this. If I use list.get, right? If I use the list.get method here and I put 0, it's going to find me the element at index position 0. Remember, 0 is the first one. It goes 0, 1, 2, ... So this will return out hi because I'm finding the first element, just like that. So the get element allows us to access things outside of our array list. Then we have the list.add method. And the list.add method allows us to add certain items to the end of our list. So for example, let's say I have the hi, hello array list, just like this with two elements, hi and hello. Both are string elements. If I do list.add and then I add by, it's going to add the by element to the end, just like this, of my actual array list. So it's inserted at the end of the actual list. So that's how to add certain elements to your array list. But what if you want to add elements in a certain position or certain place? What if I wanted to add it, for example, in between the hi and hello? Or what if I wanted to add it in the beginning like this? And that is going to be our second variant of the add method. So the funny thing here is that you actually have two methods with the same name. However, you have one with one parameter and then the other with two parameters. The first one, you put the value of the new item you want to add into as the parameter. And then for this one, with the second add one, you're adding a certain item to your array list at the location specified. So the location specified, or the index in which you're going to add your item, will be the first parameter. The second parameter will be the value that you actually want to add to your array list. So for example, let's say I have an array list like this with hi and hello again. This time, if I do list.add 0 and then by, it's going to add the string element by at index position 0. So it's going to look at index position 0, which is going to be the first element, and it's going to add by before that. So you can see here now my final result is by hi hello. This is actually very, very simple, and it's definitely very useful because not every time you want to add your element to the end of the list. Sometimes you want to add it before the list or in the middle of the list somewhere in a certain position. All right, so now the fourth method that we are going to talk about is going to be the set method for the list. And the set method has the same parameters as the add method, but the main difference is that the set method will set the value of an element at the certain position to the value that you put in the second parameter. So it's more of an override, right? It overrides the value that's already there and puts a new one rather than adding something to the list. The difference is that with the add method, the size of the array list will change. However, with the set method, the size will not change because you're simply changing a value rather than inserting one. So let's say I have this here, again, the hi, hello array list. And this time I do set 0 and then by. This time, instead of inserting a new item at index 0, it's actually going to take the entire index 0 right here, and it's going to set it to my new value, just like that. And that's the main distinction between the add and the set methods. And that is something that is very important to know. Okay, so in addition to the set method, we now have the remove method. And the remove method will remove an item from the array list at the index that is inside of the parameter. So here in your parameter, you put the index of the item that you want to remove. And then when you run that method, it's going to remove your actual item. So for example, let's say I have this. I have list of hi and hello, and then I do list.remove 0. It's going to find the item at index 0, and it's going to simply remove it from my array list. Then my result will simply just, in this case, be hello only, because the first element was removed using the remove method. And then finally, the last method that we're going to talk about is going to be a very simple one, list.size. The list.size method has no parameters, and all it does is it returns the number of elements inside of the array list. So for example, let's say I have an array list with hi, hello, and bye. It's simply going to count how many there are, 1, 2, 3, right? And it's going to print out that number. This is pretty much how many elements are inside of the array. And it's very similar to array.length, except you cannot do list.length. You can only do list.size, open, close parentheses, because it is a method. So now that you've learned about the main actual methods for array lists, the last thing that I want to talk about is going to be traversing an array list, right? With the arrays, we use for loops or for each loops to actually access each element inside of the array. And then using an array list, this is how you would do it. So you this time use a for loop as well. But remember, this time we're going to be starting our index at 0, right? And then we're going to use I is greater than. This time, instead of using array.length, we're going to be using list.size, right? And then you're going to do I++. Then to access each actual element, you have to use list.get I. So what this does is it starts out at 0. So the first time the first iteration, it's going to print out the first element of my list. And then every time that I increases, remember when this changes to 1, this will change to 2, 3, and onward, it's going to print out the next element. You can actually do some pretty cool things with this. So for example, if you change your increment, so for example, instead of having I++, if I put I plus equals 2, then it would go every second element, and it would print every second element. So this is actually a very, very interesting thing in order to traverse array lists. Unfortunately, this is the best way we can do it. We can't necessarily traverse array lists using for each. The best way to do it is using this for loop. And that way you'll be able to, all you need to do is this pretty much header, and then you have to use the list.get, remember, to actually access the element outside of the array list. So that is pretty much all you need to know for array lists. It's actually it's a pretty simple unit, especially once you learn arrays. And arrays has a lot of complicated things, especially with indexing, and you have to use brackets and all that stuff. In this case, all you have to do is just know these methods. If you know these methods and are able to apply them in scenarios and in order, it'll be very easy to pretty much work with array lists. Now, in the description below, I actually have a practice test which I have made for you. I believe it is 6 multiple choice questions, and it is a 2-part FRQ. The FRQ is definitely very, very, very aligned toward AP AP FRQs that could be on the AP exam. I specifically structured my question even using the same font and the same order and the same formatting as what they would use on the AP exam, so that it makes it easier for you to be able to get used to what made that how you may actually see it on the AP exam. And for 2020, even though we are in the pandemic and they have made some changes to the AP exam for 2020, the array/ArrayList question will still be on there. So this could be covered. So it is definitely very important that you get that practice. And it's a little bit, it's not too difficult. It's a little bit more difficult than the multiple choice section. The multiple choice section is not as bad. But definitely go into the description below. And in the description, it will say Unit 7 practice test. And it will take you to my GitHub page where you can download it. Definitely download it. Definitely try it out. And in part 2 of this video, I will be going over the answers to that particular practice test. All right, everyone, thanks for watching. If you liked the video, feel free to like and subscribe for more content. And as always, thanks for watching.